Blank. I'm the editor and publisher of Blank Slate Media, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our sit down with Robert Zimmerman, who is running on the Democratic and Working Families Party line for the 3rd Congressional District. He is opposed by George DeVolder Santos, who is running on the Republican and Conservative Party line. Mr. Santos was invited to debate Mr. Zimmerman or appear in a one-on-one interview, but did not accept. So we're here alone. This is part of a series of interviews and debates with candidates running for office this November that Blank Slate Media is holding. And I'd like to thank Robert Zimmerman in advance and our sponsor for the event and others, Northwell Health. So let's jump in. Why are you running, Robert?
Well, thank you, Steve, for the opportunity to discuss that. And let me also say my gratitude to you and Blank Slate Media and Northwell for being a sponsor. This is such an important public service. It is such an important way to connect with people, learn what's on their minds by their comments and questions, also share our ideas for our future, for our nation. And I regret that my opponent, George Santos, has declined to attend. But Steve, you're not alone. We had a couple of debates and he's canceled every one afterwards. In fact, he refused to even sit down with the editorial board of Newsday. He talks a lot about this campaign being about the people. But when it comes to answering questions from the people, he's often nowhere to be found. And that's regrettable. So that being said, thank you for this chance. And, let me just say to you in answering your question, John Meacham, the presidential historian, put it very well when he said this may be the most defining midterm election since the Civil War. That's kind of takes your breath away in a moment when you think about what it represents. And it sort of in some ways defines what motivated me to step up at this time in my life to run for public office. Because the issues that have inspired me and motivated me and brought me into public affairs are all on the line. Everything I believe in is on the line. Our democracy. I hear this from so many people, worries about the future of our democracy is on the line. How do we protect it? How do we make sure that we're not the subject to efforts to overturn it or undermine it for political purposes, as has happened in the past? Secondly, how our country reemerges from the COVID pandemic, how we come out of this inflationary period the severe inflationary period we're all facing, that I see firsthand as a small business owner. How we address the issues of protecting our personal freedoms, reproductive health for women, protecting their lives and their autonomy, standing up for my rights as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, standing up to the pandemic of gun violence in our nation, addressing the climate crisis, first in acknowledging there is a climate crisis. Regrettably, Mr. Santos refuses to recognize that, refuses to call it a climate crisis. But how do we do that and meet the energy needs of our country? These are all the issues that I think are so defining in this election and are the issues that brought me into public life initially and now are front and center in this campaign.
So let me ask you this. Right now, if you listen to the pundits and some of the polling, there's a very good chance there's a good chance, according to them, that the Republicans will win the House. Kevin McCarthy will become Speaker of the House. This is a House where 2/3 of the members voted not to certify the last presidential election after the assault on the Capitol on January 6th. How will you work with Republicans who basically have said who will not acknowledge that Joe Biden won in a free and fair election?
Well, that's a very major debating point in this campaign between myself and George Santos. George Santos attended the Stop the Steal rally on January 6th. He tweeted out the lies about the election being stolen, put that on Twitter, made claims that the election was fraudulent and attacked the results of the election. Even when he lost to Tom Suozzi by 13%, he claimed his election was being stolen too. And even more extreme than most people who try to undermine our election, he took it a step further than even most of the extremists. He actually paid the legal fees to get the insurrectionists out of jail. He was doing a video interview that was posted online, posted on Newsday, where he said that he actually paid the legal fees to get a ton of them out and defended their right to be in the Capitol. And I can read you the exact quote if you care to hear it. He said, I've actually been working on funding a ton of them to get out. When asked, I don't know why these people were in jail, he responded, no, me neither. I actually went down to DC Gitmo, which is called Washington. I wrote a nice check for a law firm to see if we can help some of them out. Then he said, question was, they're only there to exercise their right to free speech, right? And George Santos said, yes. So imagine breaking into your own house and being charged with trespassing. Just think about it. The violence of the insurrections was so severe that police officers died and over 100 police officers were injured. Many had to be hospitalized.
Okay,
So,
but to
get to your point,
go ahead.
But to get to your point, Steve, if I may, that shows no respect for our Constitution, our democracy, and no respect for our law enforcement or people who put their lives on the line to protect us. No respect for police. And so the question you ask is, how do we work with people like that? Well, first of all, the most important thing we can do on November 8th with our votes is make it clear that we respect and support free and fair elections and support the democracy and Constitution. And we make a point of voting for those people who won't engage in efforts to overturn the democracy for personal political gain. And we hold those accountable. We hold those accountable who try to overturn the election for personal agendas. Our democracy and Constitution has got to come before. It's got to come before political agendas. Now, the question you ask is, how do you work with people like that in Congress? And let me get to that. You know, I'm very proud of being able to show that I can work in a bipartisan way, and I've demonstrated that time and again, locally and nationally in Congress. And there are many issues that I hope will bring us together and provide an opportunity for bipartisanship. For example, we're facing a major issue regarding restoration of the Long Island Sound, restoration of funding for the Long Island Sound. That's always been traditionally bipartisan. In today's political climate, I don't know that it will be, but I'm going to make sure that when it comes to protecting the Long Island Sound, we keep the tradition of bipartisanship very much alive. When it comes to veterans issues, for example, making sure that we have funding for the Northport Veterans Administration. The facility needs about $300 million for infrastructure work, according to an Inspector General's report. Veterans work has always been bipartisan. I'm committed to doing that as well. And, frankly, I feel I can do it because I have done that. I worked with former Republican Congressman Peter King when it came to breaking the congressional deadlock on the Zaroga Health Act. This was a very important piece of legislation to provide medical assistance for those who were the first responders at the World Trade Center after the tragedy of 9/11, and those who were volunteers as well. They were afflicted, many of them, with cancer because of the fumes and the toxicity of the site. And the Zaroga Health Act was designed to make sure they had funding for their medical care. The Congress was deadlocked in 2010. Democrats were being obstinate for their own agenda.
You're dealing with now a new Congress.
But you know something?
You're dealing with Marjorie Taylor. There was no Marjorie Taylor Greene in 2010. There was no Lauren Boebert. There was no Paul Gosar. There was not all these really extremist people. And again, the Congress in 2020, where they can now have a majority, two-thirds of that Republican 2020 Congress voted to overturn the president.
I'm well aware of just how serious it is and well aware of the dangers of extremism. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene and what she represents is just hateful and divisive, and we have to call it out. And regrettably, George Santos actually defended her when even the Republican leadership called her out for her anti-Semitism. My opponent in this election said that she was a personal friend. He liked her more than a lot of other Republicans. It's regrettable that I'm talking about George without him being here, but you gave him the opportunity on many occasions to show up. And I think this is an election about choices. And I'm prepared to lay out my position and tell you why I differ with my opponent in this election. If he were able to defend himself, probably he would be here. But to your point, Steve, I recognize the divisions that exist in Congress. But it's up to my job, if I'm given the privilege of serving, to find those Republicans I can build common grounds with. Look, there'll be many members of Congress who don't think that I'm entitled to the same rights they are. because I'm a gay man. They don't think I'm entitled to the right to marry, right to adopt or have children. I understand that. And that's painful and that's difficult. But at the end of the day, my goal and my commitment is to serve our congressional district and to find ways to build bipartisan coalitions. And quite frankly, Steve, we saw more bipartisanship this past year than we've seen in previous years in Congress. There's the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the first investment, the largest investment in infrastructure in 50 years since Eisenhower, which is so critical for us on Long Island in terms of protecting our water quality, fixing our roads, protecting the Long Island Sound from increased sewage and nitrogen being spewed into it, retrofitting our sewage treatment plants. So that was one achievement. The first time there was a bipartisan gun safety legislation, first time in 30 years. That was a small first step, but an important first step we have to build on. So there's bipartisanship there. The Semiconductor Chip and Scientific Research Act. So we've seen, and also dealing with the veterans legislation, dealing with the pits, the toxic pits in Afghanistan and Iraq. There was finally bipartisanship there. I'm not suggesting it's going to be easy, but that's the challenge of leadership, to find ways to build coalitions when we can, and when we can't, to use our electoral power to change the makeup of Congress. And right now with November 8th, our focus has got to be to make sure we have a Congress that's going to codify Roe v. Wade, to make sure we have a Congress that defends our democracy, to make sure we have a Congress that's going to try to ease the fiscal burdens on the American people during this very difficult inflationary period. So okay. I'm not that cynical, Steve. I'm not prepared to give up on it. We are facing a difficult time, but we've seen in this past year bipartisanship. I think we can do it. I think we can build on it.
You mentioned inflation, and that is inflation and the economy. In terms of let me ask you about the economy in general. We understand inflation, but let me ask you in terms of the economy and inflation, where do you see the problem of inflation coming from, and what can be done to at least ease the pain that so many people are feeling, and that is really driving a number of people into the Republican camp?
I have to tell you, this is not a political debate for me. When I talk about inflation and the economy, I'm speaking as a small business owner for 33 years. When I came home from Washington after serving on Capitol Hill, Ron Edelson and I started our firm, Zimmerman Edelson Creative Communications, and then with David Chauvin joining as a partner, now with ZE Creative Communications. And we've run our business through difficult times, and I know the burden of inflation, what it means to small business owners, what it means to young families, what it means to the people who are members of our team, our senior citizens. I understand these are real life issues. And frankly, there are many issues that drove inflation, in particular, the fact that as we emerged from the pandemic, demand was high and supply was low. Let's start with that. It was exacerbated by the war in Iraq. It had a severe impact on the energy marketplace. And the
war in Iraq, or?
I'm so sorry, the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine, forgive me. The war in Ukraine. Putin's invasion into Ukraine had a severe impact on the food markets because Ukraine's an agrarian basket. It's a great bread basket for the Ukrainian people and for Eastern Europe in particular. In addition, it had a tremendous impact on the instability of the oil markets. So those were factors that contributed to it as well.
How do you think Joe Biden has done in handling that?
In Ukraine? I have to tell you.
No, handling inflation.
Look, there are many aspects of what he's done that I support. I'd like to see him take more aggressive steps in dealing with I'd like to see him make restoring the state and local tax deduction a top priority. It should be part of any new tax bill going forward. And believe me, as a member of Congress, I'm going to be certain, I'm given the privilege of serving, to make sure that when it comes to dealing with the state and local tax deduction, I'm going to put that front and center in any bill pertaining to taxes. I think it's essential. So that's one thing. I'd like to see more aggressiveness dealing with that. I also think the administration should be more aggressive dealing with price gouging. We're seeing the oil industry, the food industry, and other industries making record profits off of this difficult period. So I think that's a real issue. Furthermore, I think they have to be more forthcoming in discussing how they're using the bipartisan infrastructure bill and laying out more directly their plan of action here, so we can see how the supply lines can be improved. Because that's a major purpose of that bill, was to improve our airports, our harbors, and our transportation of product for the American people. So I think there are steps you could take there, but I must tell you, I very much applaud the bill that was just adopted into law, the Schumer-Manchin bill signed by President Biden, that for the first time uses Medicare to reduce the cost of prescription drugs for our elderly, for those who are Medicare recipients. The fact that we're now capping for insulin per month at $35 and capping out-of-pocket yearly costs for Medicare recipients at $2,000 for prescription drugs. It's still too high, but this was a very important initiative. And I think it's to be credited. I'd like to see, in fact, there was a plan to expand Medicare to reduce the cost of prescription drugs for all of us, but they couldn't get one Republican vote, not one, to move that forward. And quite frankly, my opponent in this election has made it clear he doesn't support that legislation to reduce the cost of prescription drugs, as he didn't support the bipartisan infrastructure bill.
There was legislation to basically make it easier to build the energy infrastructure. And that was rejected. It would have cut down the time it takes to get energy lines online. It would have helped in terms of drilling. It would have helped in building new production plants. But Democrats also opposed it. This was backed by Joe Manchin and by Chuck Schumer, and House Democrats. Some House Democrats refused to go along with that. Should that be, given the impact of energy that's only going to become more pronounced this winter as Putin attempts to use energy to drive a wedge in NATO and punish Ukraine, shouldn't we be making it easier to build the infrastructure to generate all forms of energy, including oil and gas?
Well, it's important to know that the production of oil now is up to 12 million barrels a day. That's almost as high as it was in 2019. And it's going to exceed by 2023 the highest point. It'll exceed the highest point of, I think it was in 2020. So in other words, we're going to be drilling more oil than ever in 2023. We're already exceeding the 2019 level and at 12 million barrels a day. And it's going to accelerate in 2023. Now, for the short term, we have to rely upon oil and gas to stabilize the markets, to make sure we can keep the price of gasoline down for consumers, to keep the price of food down. So we have to, in the short term, regrettably have to rely upon oil and gas. There's no question about it. And there's a lot of leasing on private land that the oil industry has access to if they choose to have access to it. But it's not an either or choice. And I really do regret and very much reject this argument that we can't pursue renewables and make a priority of building a renewable environmental economy, because we really have to. It's not an either or choice. Yes, in the short term. But
right now there's a real crisis. Number one, prices are going to go up. The Saudis and OPEC have joined with Russia, and they are decreasing the production of oil by 2 million barrels a day. And the Russians are threatening to cut off energy in Europe during the winter and in the Ukraine. What should be done now?
Well, I think one thing
I'm not limiting it to oil and gas.
One thing we should be doing for sure.
But should not the process of getting other sources online, whatever it is, the approval process takes a long time for anything, for transmission lines, for even for wind and solar to get things approved. Yeah. Shouldn't that be reduced? Shouldn't that time be cut down so that things can be put online?
Well, two things have to be done immediately. I feel very strongly about this. First of all, I think the Biden administration has got to be a lot more aggressive in dealing with Saudi Arabia. We could suspend military equipment that they rely upon, like Patriot missiles. They rely upon our government to provide them with 70% of their defense weaponry and also airplane parts. And we could suspend that as well. There's leverage we could use against Saudi Arabia that we should be using and not allow them to destabilize the oil markets for us or any part of the world. So I think they should be much more aggressive dealing with the Saudis. I think also we have to look at ways to expedite the permitting process to be able to accelerate the development of renewables. whether it's wind, hydro, or solar. That has to be done. So I think that's critical as well. I'm very pleased by the fact that we now have the largest investment in clean energy union jobs in the history of our country to address the climate crisis. And I think certainly we're seeing the acceleration of oil being developed. I mentioned before, we're going to exceed 12 million barrels a day. That's an extraordinary, that's a high level. It's regrettable that we have to rely upon oil and gas at this stage, but in the short term, we do. So I think that's very important, but I don't want to see us move to offshore oil drilling. I don't want to see that off the East Coast or the West Coast. There's a lot of leased land that is available that the oil industry has access to that they could build on if they chose to. So they have that access for that. But you know something, if you really want to stabilize the energy marketplace, the future is going to be in solar, wind, hydro, improving our transmission lines to be able to take in the renewable energy that's being developed. That's going to be important. I mean, the idea that we're buying our solar panels from China and not investing in domestic production here at home is reprehensible. That has to change. The process is beginning, but we've got to accelerate that too. So yes, I agree with you that when it comes to addressing our energy crisis, we've got to expedite the permitting process for renewables. We are in fact seeing the drilling and development of oil exceeding in our country up to literally 12 million barrels a day. And that's we're going to have a record high of that. In the short term, we need it, but I want to underscore to you that we have to recognize we have a climate crisis. We're all being impacted by severe weather and by the tremendous impact of the danger of the climate crisis we're living in. I can't think of a community in our congressional district that hasn't had homes impacted, people's life savings destroyed in property damage, small businesses destroyed. In the borough of Queens, 11 people died living in basement apartments because of the flooding and as the remnants of Hurricane Ida. So we understand the remnants of the storm of Hurricane Ida. We have to make addressing the climate crisis an absolute essential priority. And we first have to acknowledge it is a climate crisis. My opponent has not in this election. And I don't want to be put in a position where the choice is either or. Yes, in the short term, we've got to deal with oil and gas and make sure we have it. But in the long term, we've got to understand the future is going to be in recognizing the climate crisis and making sure we create clean energy union jobs and prepare America and help America move into the new economy. That's going to be essential. And to make sure people can transition with proper job training to that new economy, because that's the future.
A major part of the issue of the criticism of you and Democrats across the country in almost every campaign is crime. The direct mail pieces we see, and the attacks from your opponent. You're soft on crime. You supported bail reform. You are backed by people who push to defund the NYPD. What's your response to that?
As you know, Steve, I've been endorsed for Congress by former New York City Police Commissioner Bill Bratton, who served as police commissioner in Los Angeles and in Boston, considered one of the finest law enforcement officials in the nation. Do you think he would back anybody who was for defunding the police? Do you think he'd back anybody who was supporting the type of climate we have in the bail reform initiative put forward by the state legislature? I think we can all agree that no one should be in jail because of the color of their skin or because they're poor. But as I've said in your newspaper, and I've said publicly, the bail reform put forward by the state legislature was counterproductive. It actually created a dangerous climate. I have always called for judges. It's in my website since I began my campaign. You can go back to my first interviews with you and other media. I've always called for judges having more discretion in terms of awarding sentences so they can look at a defendant's past. I've called for making sure that hate crimes are not met with an appearance ticket, but met with the full penalties of the law. People committing gun crimes should be, in fact, incarcerated and held to the full extent of the law, faced with the fullest penalties of the law. So, you know,
let me ask you about bail reform.
let me finish my point, Steve.
Okay.
I think we can talk about, I'll talk to you about bail reform, but as a member of Congress, what I can do most impactfully is to make sure that our police are fully funded. They're given the tools and the support and equipment they need to do their job. That's why I've been a strong advocate nationally of federal initiatives to fully fund our police, give them the proper support to deal with hate crimes, the proper training and that they've asked for to help address the elevation of crime that they're facing, taking them out of areas that they don't want to be part of, that don't deal with fighting crime. They're not there to be caseworkers. They're there to address crime, and we have to support them in that effort. But likewise, you can't talk about this issue with any credibility without talking about gun safety legislation. And that is absolutely one of the most important. It's the moral test of our time to make sure that children going to school don't have to do more shooter drills than fire drills. Parents shouldn't have to worry about their children's safety. People going to work during the day should not have to be filled with the fear of someone having a gun illegally, or someone engaging in having an assault weapon in a shopping center or a house of worship or a public school. So it's a big difference between myself and George Santos, who has said he doesn't believe in any new gun safety legislation. He's very public about that. He supports the gun manufacturer's position on this. I think we have to put in place very important legislation to make sure teenagers can't buy assault weapons and ban assault weapons. Get rid of ghost guns, put in place red flag laws, limit the number of bullets in magazines. We have to make sure that we have stronger background checks so people can't avoid background checks by buying guns in gun shows. So that way, but if you buy a gun in a gun show, you can avoid a background check. And we also have to finally address the trafficking of guns across state lines. The idea that, we have very strict laws in New York State. People come from all over the country and they sell or they traffic in illegal weapons. That's got to be addressed with very federal aggressiveness, with the full penalties of the law and the full force of the federal government. So I think we're talking, and by the way, let's be clear. I'm not saying take guns away from people who need them at their home for their personal protection and who got their guns legally. I'm not saying take guns away from hunters or people who enjoy sports marksmanship and the like. But we've got to step up and understand that we have to address the pandemic of gun violence in this country. George Santos has made it clear he doesn't see the need for new gun laws. There's been
in New York State particularly, bail reform has been blamed for the rise in crime. This ignores the fact that all 49 other states have had similar increases in crime. And the fact is that the studies that have been done on the data is bail reform, particularly in its, bail reform has had little or no effect, according to the studies on this, which raises the question, if that's not the case, if it isn't bail reform in New York, then what is it what caused the increase in crime? You mentioned gun laws. Are there other issues that you see are behind the fact that since 2020, there's been a significant 2020 had been actually, crime had gone down for 20 years or so. Mm-hmm. Then it went up in 2020. What do you think is the cause? What other causes other than gun laws for the increase, and how would you combat it?
I think bail reform and the way it was implemented certainly contributed to the increase in crime on different levels. I think tying the hands of judges and prosecutors is proven to be a dangerous strategy. And I think there has to be important fixes.
That didn't happen in the other 49 states.
Well, I can just speak to what we've seen in New York State, and the state legislature has to address it. But I would tell you this, we also have to consider and look at the impact of the pandemic, the amount of homelessness, the amount of mental health crises that exist, people being put out of their jobs, and people living in very abject, desperate conditions. So I think there are a lot of factors that contribute to it, but certainly I think as a member of Congress, I've got to keep my focus on making sure we have strong gun safety legislation in place, which is, I think we've got to expand upon the bill that was just adopted. And I think we also have to address making sure that we're giving the police the support they need, and make sure we continue strong investments in mental health, because that's a real factor too. The record amount of homelessness that we've witnessed, the lack of proper mental health support for people who are facing these crises in their life is also a serious factor.
Abortion, we touched on it briefly, but again, your view on what Congress ought to do regarding abortion.
Well, the most important thing Congress can do immediately is codify Roe v. Wade to make sure that we protect abortion rights, reproductive freedom for women and their personal autonomy. Because there is a movement in Congress, and do not underestimate it, to create a national ban on abortion. And I know what all the politicians on the right are saying, what the Republicans are saying. They didn't mean it. They'll never do it again. They didn't really intend it. My opponent in this election, George Santos, advocated, was quoted in your newspaper, as advocating a national ban on abortion. Actually said he wanted to prosecute doctors who provided abortion services, actually advocated no exceptions for abortion. And he did say that women would actually use rape as an excuse to get an abortion. I mean, think about that for a moment. It's such a hateful, misogynistic thing to say, that women would actually fake rape to get an abortion. That's George Santos's position. Here's mine. My position is to make sure we codify Roe v. Wade, pass the Women's Health Protection Act, to make sure that, in fact, women have control of their own autonomy, their own health, and their personal freedom. These decisions should be between a woman and her doctor. That's it. It shouldn't be among politicians, should not be in the waiting room or in the medical or in the doctor's office, as the expression goes. And we saw 50 years of Roe v. Wade overturned by Supreme Court justices who said they'd respect precedent and made it very clear in their testimony they would respect precedent and the first opportunity to overturn this decision. It tells you what's coming up ahead. Certainly, Clarence Thomas made it very clear the Dobbs decision opens up the door for overturning marriage equality and could certainly have an impact, certainly have a very dramatic impact on intimate relationships, as he put it. And we saw the Republicans in Congress vote against contraception. I mean, I can't even comprehend the thinking behind that, but they did. And so I think all these factors lay out a very important division in this campaign between myself and my opponent. And I know what the argument they're saying now is, well, in New York State, nothing changes. The Dobbs decision changes everything, because the next step is going to be a national ban on abortion. My opponent made the case for that. So many other Republicans. And we can't, in the same way people were caught napping because they thought Roe v. Wade would be the law of the land forever. Don't make the same mistake again and assume when they say, well, it's not going to change in New York. Like they said, don't worry, Roe v. Wade is precedent that can't be overturned. It can easily be taken away if we drop our guard. This election is in many ways a referendum of where we stand on reproductive freedom. And you know where I stand. I've been endorsed by Planned Parenthood, the National Institute of Reproductive Health, and NARAL, National Abortion Rights Action League, because I respect a woman's right to their own personal autonomy and their own reproductive health.
Let's talk about when we talk about democracy, and that's the other big issue on the table, according to many of the polls. That is high up. What can be done right now? Right now, you have many states are looking for ways to suppress the vote by changing voting laws, making it more difficult, particularly in minority communities, for young people to vote. And you have, if you have a Republican Congress, you will be in the Congress if you win, and the Republicans carry it. You'll be in a Congress that could decide right now, as it stands, the 2024 election for president. So, what is your strategy? How do you protect democracy? How do you protect the fact that that voters will actually choose the next president? Well, and not Congress or state officials.
Do
that.
It's a very important question, Steve, and quite frankly, it's an issue we can't take lightly, because we saw what happened 2 years ago. An effort to overturn the election on lies, on fake news, if you will, false accusations. It's worth noting, by the way, that Donald Trump's top advisors, his attorney general, his director of cybersecurity and election security, Christopher Krebs, his FBI director, all came back and said the same thing. There was no level of fraud that would in any way compromise the election results. And the elections were safe and secure and legitimate. And yet we still see Donald Trump peddling the big lie. We still see too many people who supported that effort to overturn the election, like my opponent, try to run for office. And they're all changing their tune now, except for Donald Trump. And they're all being a bit more circumspect about it. But it's an issue we should take very seriously because believe me, they're going to try it again. Why wouldn't they?
So
If they're not held accountable politically, if they're not held accountable by the electorate for trying to overturn the 2020 presidential election, what would stop them? So I think the most important thing we can do with our votes this election day is make sure we vote for people who support our democracy, who support our Constitution. And I think we're seeing an important initiative put through in Congress. It's a small one, but important. And that is clearing up the questions about how to count electoral votes, to make sure the electoral votes are counted properly, and we can't have a situation where a rogue vice president could in fact interfere with the counting of electoral votes, or for that matter, members of Congress could try to interrupt counting electoral votes or stop the vote from going forward. The Electoral Count Act is an important piece of legislation that we should be supportive of, and it's important, but it's really a first step. I think there are many other steps we could take to. I'd abolish the Electoral College if given the opportunity, or look for other ways to at least legislatively make sure the Electoral College does not interfere with the popular vote. So I think that's important. Plus, we have to make sure that voting remains accessible. Voting by absentee ballot, voting in person. I think election day should be a national holiday, quite frankly. And I think early voting is critical and key to ensure voter access. And I think absentee ballots have got to be more accessible as well. So there are a lot of steps that can be taken. There's the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, I think is worth exploring as well. I support it strongly. I think that hopefully will take some form. But it all begins with our vote this November 8th. And early voting starts this Saturday, October 28th. We have to be very certain we support people who support our democracy. It's kind of remarkable. We even have to have this discussion. I never thought we'd ever be talking about in a campaign season, protecting the constitutional process of our elections. But John Meacham was not wrong when he said, this is the most defining election since the midterm, since the Civil War, because it's about the future of our republic, and the future of our republic rides on protecting our democratic process and upholding our Constitution.
do you think there is sufficient basis from the January 6th committee's investigation to refer criminal charges against President Trump to the Justice Department?
You know, I think we have to leave that to the Department of Justice. I remember being so offended by the way Donald Trump tried to use the Department of Justice for his political hits on his opponents. His famous expression, "Where's my Roy Cohn?" He saw the Department of Justice as nothing more than a squad to go after his opposition and to engage in prosecution and harassment of his opposition. It's well documented by even his own administration. Members of his administration called him in, tried to hold him in check for his conduct. So the last thing I think we need are Democrats in Congress or Democratic politicians or Democratic officials trying to tell the Department of Justice what they should be doing. We should respect the independence of the Department of Justice, as we have amongst Republican and Democratic administrations in the past. It's always been regarded as independent. We should respect their independence, let them make their evaluation based upon how they see the law and how the law is administered.
But if the Justice Department, in the face of all the evidence, fails to act, aren't they inviting a repeat? If there is no accountability for what took place on January 6, 2020, and actually started months earlier.
That's right.
In terms of undermining people's confidence in the election system, which has only grown since then. If they don't hold them accountable, what is to stop anyone else from ever doing it again?
Well, you know, Steve, that's a very critical point. And that's why the January 6th commission hearings are so important. It's worth remembering, by the way.
Committee didn't do a commission.
I'm sorry, January committee hearings, you're right. I was about to say, there was a proposal to establish a January 6th congressional commission on this issue. People forget that. The Democrats went to the Republicans and said, you can have the same number of members as we do, the same subpoena power as the Democrats, and share everything 50-50. Let's get a bipartisan, fully operational investigation going where you'll have this, Republicans have the same authority as Democrats to come together, get the facts. They could subpoena, each side could subpoena who they felt was appropriate and get the information. And the Republicans rejected it. Now they're turning around and they're trying to attack the commission. They could have changed the committee, rather. They could have changed it if they wanted to, but they clearly wanted to, in fact, whitewash it. And you're seeing right now, what really worries me more than anything is that there's an effort by the Republican Congress to try to whitewash what happened, to try to ignore it, pass on the facts. You know, when it did take place, Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy spoke really very aggressively against the fact that Donald Trump incited the violence behind January 6th and condemned him strongly for what he did. Now that we're a couple of years removed, almost 2 years removed, they're trying to dismiss the relevance of the committee, their hearings, and the evidence they've unfolded. And that's really, I think, tragic, because there are some issues, many issues that should rise above politics. What happened on January 6th should unite our country to make sure that doesn't happen again. I don't see that national unity, and I think that's really a travesty. I'm hoping when the work is done, this will be and remember, the testimony is not partisan testimony. The testimony is from Donald Trump's top people, his top advisors, people who were with him throughout the entire process. They're the ones bringing up the most tragic and revealing aspects of what happened that day and the planning leading up to it. So you can't call this partisan when it's really Donald Trump's own people, his own top advisors, who are responsible for the testimony that we're listening to. That being said, it's my hope that the results of the investigation of the committee are going to, in fact, galvanize the country, hopefully move our consciences, and that will affect our votes. I think it's very important. If it doesn't, I'm really very concerned about our future.
Ukraine, we touched on that.
Mm-hmm.
It was recently, a couple of days ago, some members of the Progressive Caucus wrote a letter calling for the Biden administration to press Ukraine to negotiate a settlement of the war between Russia and Ukraine. They've withdrawn that since. What do you think the policy ought to be?
Let me just say to you how reprehensible that proposal is. The idea that our government play any role to try to undermine the heroic, almost biblically heroic fight of the Ukrainian people. The leadership that the Ukrainian people have shown, they've been a model to the world with their courage, their heroism, the way they've stood up to this autocratic mass murderer that Vladimir Putin is, and what he's done to that region. So I stand proudly with the people of Ukraine. I stand very proudly in awe of their heroism. And I think it's reprehensible to try to in any way pressure the Ukrainian people to accept the invasion of their country by an autocratic dictator. You know, it's the first time in Eastern Europe we've seen an invasion of another country, of an independent country, since Hitler in World War II. And history should teach us that we cannot in any way try to accommodate or try to appease autocrats, mass murderers, and dictators like that. We have to call them out for what they are and stand up to them. And that's why I admire the Ukrainian people. In the same way, I must point out to you, Kevin McCarthy recently said, as a Republican leader of the House, that the Ukrainian government could not rely upon unlimited financial aid from the United States or military aid. I thought it was a reprehensible thing to say. I think it was undermining the Ukrainian people at such an important time. So I very much condemn what McCarthy said, as I condemn what the Progressive Caucus said in that regard. I think both sides have withdrawn their comments. I hope they have, because I think it's inexcusable.
Let me ask you, we have an ad this week in our paper about your strong support for Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Israel has been sort of equivocated on its support for Ukraine. It hadn't until, I don't know whether it has or maybe now it's considering, since Saudi Arabia and Iran are now backing Russia, Iran with arms, the Saudis with oil. in their fight with Ukraine. What should be the expectation by this country of Israel in terms of supporting Ukraine and our efforts to maintain democracy in Europe?
Well, actually, Israel has spoken out condemning the invasion of Vladimir Putin into Ukraine. It's been very clear in stating their opposition to what Vladimir Putin has done.
They haven't sent arms, though. Up to this point, they haven't been sending arms to Ukraine.
I'm not familiar with the negotiations that are going on or the role they're playing, but I really must tell you, I think it's a mistake to in any way think Israel was in any way sympathetic to Vladimir Putin or did not condemn him, because as I recall, they did condemn him early on. And so I think it's an important point. But I think, frankly, what the Biden administration has done in Ukraine, I think, is really reasserting America's world leadership. And I think that's worth pointing out. The idea that, the Biden administration came in as they did, united the European Union and united our NATO allies to, in fact, provide consistent support for Ukraine. It's a very hard thing to do. Consistent military support for Ukraine, ratchet up the pressure on Russia, all the time being aware that Vladimir Putin has more nuclear weapons than Russia has more nuclear weapons than any other country in the world. And at what point do you tip the scales and provide where he produces a very dangerous counter reaction? I think it's been a great military feat watching the world come together and watching the European Union, our NATO allies, and the United States come together in support of Ukraine. And in fact, seeing, Russia now is really immersed in another Afghanistan, if you will. The Ukrainian people's resilience and strength has really put Russia on the defensive. They've suffered severe costs, the Ukrainian people, severe losses, but they have been so courageous. And I'm very pleased to see the leadership the Biden administration is playing in terms of how they've approached this situation and how they've really united the world community against Vladimir Putin.
Do you see that support dissipating or being divided with rising energy prices in Europe and food prices? Right now, there's a threat they're going to cut that off, that they're going to cut off any energy to Europe, and then you'll see a real spike. Right now, we're seeing what inflation is doing here, and that would raise prices here as well.
Sure.
Do you see that resolved there, or do you think that there's a threat that that'll be undermined by rising energy prices in Europe and here?
Look, I mean, let's face it, there are real burdens we're all going to face. But a much greater burden for our nation and for the world would be to in any way appease Vladimir Putin. Because let's be clear, Ukraine is not the end game. Ukraine is just the first step in Vladimir Putin's very public mission to reassemble the old Soviet Union. He'd be marching into Poland if he had the opportunity. And so he'd be expanding his military operation and just move through Ukraine. So I would hope, and I'll certainly work very hard to make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that we may have short-term real burdens to address, and we have to address it as a country. And I think there are steps we can take to alleviate the burdens here. But the much greater tragedy for our nation and for the world would be to in any way appease Vladimir Putin, allow him to march forward and occupy or take over part of Ukraine or expand beyond Ukraine. We have to hold the world community together against this type of dictatorial behavior, this type of autocratic mass murdering strategy, and show that we're going to stand up to it. And we can't be pressured into giving in to him or trying to in any way appease his agenda. History's taught us, not too long ago, what happens when the world community looks the other way or doesn't take the actions of a mass murderer or a dictator seriously. So we have to be very conscious of those lessons. We're going to have some challenges here, but let's remember, Russia's got a lot more challenges right now. Their country is, there are mass exodus from Russia. The biggest Google search in Russia right now literally is how you break your arm, how one breaks their arm to avoid serving in the military. And Russia has gotten themselves in way over their head because they underestimated the Ukrainian people and the world's opposition to them.
Final foreign policy, but China and Taiwan is a big issue. President Biden has said they invade Taiwan, China invade Taiwan, the United States will come to the aid of Taiwan. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with it. And that's one of the more important reasons we have to stay strong in addressing the crisis in Ukraine. And I think once we look the other way, you'll see China accelerate into Taiwan. They're watching very closely how the world responds to Ukraine. And I think it's very important that we stay united as one world community responding. And that's why I admire the leadership of the United States in this issue. I think they've been very skillful, both militarily and diplomatically, in balancing a lot of different interests, the interests of the European Union, our allies, and of course, making sure we can support our Ukraine as much as possible and to the full extent we can. Because once we move from there, then you're going to see, once we move off that base, you'll see China accelerate into Taiwan. But you raise an important point. There's a lot we should be addressing in the world community right now. I think the rebellion we're seeing in Iran from the courageous freedom fighters, the Iranian women and their freedom fighter allies, is very important in terms of stepping up to that oppressive regime. And I would hope the United States would be playing a very aggressive role, a more aggressive role in supporting the freedom fighters there and standing up to and supporting them in their movement against what they call the moral authority police, I believe it is, and this oppressive, hateful regime. And it also, I think, speaks to another aspect I think we should touch upon, and that Israel's critical and important role for the United States and for the world community. I am very concerned about those who want to undermine our relationship with Israel. Israel's not just been a great ally, it's been a great friend of the United States. They offer tremendous support, both in terms of technology, intelligence sharing, and the like. So I think I think the United States really only benefits from expanding the Abraham Accords and standing up for making sure that aid to Israel is not negotiable, as some from the left are advocating. I think it's very important that we keep our bond with Israel very strong and solid, our aid secure and guaranteed, and we do everything we can to not let anything interfere with our strong alliance, our strong relationship with Israel. They are truly the only democracy, our only friend in the region.
Second to last question. The issue of you have right now is this question of the big lie and where people are getting their information. You have a majority of, at least, or a large majority of the Republican Party, millions of people that believe that Joe Biden didn't win in a free and fair election.
Yeah.
And that's just the start of all the other conspiracy theories. You have QAnon, you have the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, and these people. How does one deal with this inability? These are people that are convinced that the election was stolen, despite all the information to the contrary. How do you deal with that as a country? Where one side is just impervious to facts.
You ask, how do you deal with it? I have to deal with it because my opponent's one of those people spreading all the conspiracy theories and big lies about the 2020 election, he claimed it was stolen, about his election, claiming it was stolen. And it is profoundly worrisome to me. And it's something that we have to be very vigilant about. We've never had more access to news in the history of the world. You can pick up your phone and fact check virtually anything because Wall Street Journal, the Associated Press, the Washington Post, PolitiFact, which won the Pulitzer Prize for checking. You can fact check anything. We have more access to more information than ever, but less interest in seeing it. Regrettably, people watch the news not to learn, but to be reinforced, to have their predisposed positions enforced. And this is true for people from the left and the right. So I think the only way you can do it, and sometimes it's tough, believe me, I've had to deal with it, is speak truth to power. Stand up for what you believe in, lay out your facts, and also be respectful of other people. And that's missing a lot in our dialogue today. We can differ with people, but we have to always have a common basis of facts and have respect for what people have to say, even though it may be maddening at times. You know, I talk about this a lot in my campaign for Congress, and it's really about, and I define my election this way, the mainstream values I represent versus the extremist positions my opponent's taken. And when I, first went to Capitol Hill as an intern working for Lester Wolf, our job was always to find a Republican staffer to make a friend with. It was the way everybody did that because the goal was to reach across the aisle, to have mainstream values. I'm very proud of the fact that Newsday endorsed me because they regard me as someone who can do that, reach across the aisle, work with other people to get results. Regrettably, that seems to be kind of antiquated thinking. Tom Suozzi did it effectively. Peter King did it effectively. Gary Ackerman did it as well as Steve Israel. We've had a long history of members of Congress from our district who avoided extremism and put serving the people and delivering for their district first. And that's going to be my responsibility. So how do you address the question you raise? It's going to be tough, but you know something? It's going to be very important to show through our political process, through our voting and participating, that we want to protect our democracy. We're going to elect people who believe in our democratic process. And we're going to also make an effort to listen to each other, work with each other. So when it comes to dealing with jet noise in Queens or over East Hills, I'm going to bring Republicans and Democrats together to do that and hold the FAA accountable. When it comes to dealing with the Long Island Sound, I'm going to continue a bipartisan tradition of funding to protect the Long Island Sound. When it comes to veterans issues, I'm going to work in a mainstream way in a bipartisan coalition. It can be done. It's more challenging now than ever, but it's more important than ever. So that's my mission, and that's how I define the job in Congress. I'm certainly going to stand up on principle, but I'm also going to be able to find ways to deliver for our district as well. One is not exclusive from the other.
You're kind of answering my final question, which is, but I'll give you a shot to do it
Okay.
regardless. Why should voters vote for you rather than your opponent?
Well, it's regrettable that George has chosen not to participate in most of the debates we've been offered this year, and wouldn't meet with editorial boards and the like. Because I think it's important for the voters to know that this election's about them. And we have an obligation to tell the voters how we feel about issues and hear what they have to say about issues too. It's about how we can learn from each other, the voters and the candidates. I'm running for Congress because I believe it's essential to return the mainstream values to our political process, to be able to show that we can work in a bipartisan way to deliver services that are needed for our district, whether it's our environmental protection, protecting our infrastructure, whether it's providing greater veteran services, dealing with quality of life issues like jet noise, or restoring the state and local tax deduction. I think I'm running for Congress to stand for the principles that brought me into public life, protecting our democracy, standing up for the rights of the LGBTQ plus community, standing up for reproductive freedom. It's not mutually exclusive, and it shouldn't be a choice of either or. You can stand on principle, and you can also find ways to work with people to deliver for the district. I have had the privilege of working on Capitol Hill, and for members of Congress representing Long Island, I've had the privilege of learning a lot about life and service by building my small business now in its 33rd year. But I think those real life experiences give me an important look at what Congress should be about. It wasn't too long ago that we worked in a bipartisan way to get results. And I think we have to bring that back as effectively as we can, reach across the aisle and put our constituents before partisanship. I'm committed to do that wherever possible. And I'm running for Congress at a time right now where we have to focus on trying to rebuild our country after the COVID pandemic, try to move forward out of this dangerous inflationary period, and also protect our democracy and our freedoms. That's why I'm proud to be a candidate for Congress. And that's why I'm proud to ask for the support of all of you who are listening.
Okay, I'd like to thank Robert Zimmerman for participating in this discussion. I'd also like to thank again Northwell Health for sponsoring this evening's discussion. For those who are unable to watch today, a recording will be found on Blank Slate Media's website, The Island 360. And you can also go to, we'll have a link from our Facebook page, and you can go directly to YouTube to see the recording. a story about this evening's. I'm calling it this evening. We're now getting dark at 6, so I think we can call it evening. About this evening's event will appear in the 6 Blank Slate Media newspapers next week, and on our website, theisland360.com. Again, I thank Robert Zimmerman for
Thank
taking
you.
the time and sharing his views. Thank you.
Thank you.